Mission ready to go.
In Los Angeles, where it is 3 hours earlier than Florida, NBC's affiliate, KNBC, decided to cover the launch live.
This is a special report from Channel 4 News. Good morning, I'm Ken Shocknick, and Space Shuttle Challenger is just a few seconds away from blasting off from the Kennedy Space Center near Cape Canaveral, Florida. Let's take a look right now. Challenger finally getting ready to leave KSC. Its launch delayed a couple of times because of weather and mechanical problems.
T-minus 15 seconds.
The voice of launch control, Hugh Harris of NASA.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff.
Solid rocket boosters kicking in.
25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Challenger going into its roll. That's planned.
Good roll program.
Spiral away from pad 39B, the first use of pad 39B since the old Apollo days and the Skylab missions. It's chilly in Florida. Icicles formed on the pad overnight. NASA engineers were concerned that they might have broken off during the launch and affected the fragile heat protection tiles that protect the shuttle on its way back in during re-entry.
We'll throttle down to 65% shortly.
Don't know what the effect might be just yet. The astronauts will take a look later on during the mission.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs.
APUs, the auxiliary power
Velocity,
units.
2,257 feet per second. Altitude, 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance, 3 nautical miles.
It's always amazing to hear how quickly the shuttle moves. It's already more than 4 miles downwind, as we just
Engines
heard.
throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go and throttle up.
Challenger, go and throttle up.
The shuttle mission will launch, my God.
1 minute 15
There's been an explosion.
Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
This is not standard. This is not something that is planned, of course. I can see a solid rocket booster has broken away from Shuttle Challenger. That's what you're looking at in the middle of your screen. I cannot see the shuttle itself. I don't know if it's able to continue on one rocket booster. If it's able to jettison that rocket booster, it will be able to return to the Kennedy Space Center. Perhaps the shuttle engines are not enough to power the shuttle back down. It would have to shut down.
Looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
I hope they were able to survive. I hope the astronauts...
We have no downlink.
We have absolutely no sign at all of the shuttle itself. All we saw was that one explosion only about a minute into the flight, and we saw the solid rocket booster. Now here's something coming down. I don't know what that is. I don't think that that's the shuttle. I believe that's a piece of debris that's coming back earthbound. I don't know. It's too small for the shuttle itself. Pieces falling out of the sky in the Florida morning. It's about 20 till noon in Florida. There are contingency plans for the shuttle when something does go wrong, when something goes terribly wrong.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
8:40, and we hear from launch control, the vehicle has exploded. That's the orbiter itself, the Shuttle Challenger, has exploded. We
Contingency procedures are in effect.
Assume that the crew is not alive. This is unheralded in the history of the space program. Ladies and gentlemen, I have covered the space shuttle launches since the very first launch, since before the first launch itself, going way back, and nothing like this has ever happened. Of course, there was the Apollo fire on the ground at the Kennedy Space Center, the Apollo 1 fire that killed 3 astronauts during a test run back in the 60s, but the shuttle program itself, to this time, has been untouched by any human problem.
Sitting in the Engine House Deli in Winchester, Kentucky, and the news reporter came on and announced that there was going to be some footage that we were going to watch. How many of you remember that? That's what I thought, most of you. It was a tragic time in our history, and one that reminds me so much of the issue of risk. I sat there as that two-pronged smoke came up on the screen, and I knew what I was looking at. Only later did I hear the words of Dan Rather when he talked about the 7 that were on there and them being star voyagers. And then he said, died in the sky on the way to space in the history books. President Reagan reminded us that all of America stands beside them. We almost knew them by first name, Dick and Mike and Judy and Ron and Elle and Greg and, of course, Krista. But the most prominent thing in my memory book was the memorial service where one little girl by the name of Erin Smith stood with her teddy bear, and they were dressed in similar dresses that day. And Erin was holding on to her sister of 15 years old, Allison, and there it was that they were going through that retching memorial service where their father, Michael J. Smith, had died on the Space Shuttle Challenger. As I analyzed that this week, I looked at a number of videos, and I'm just going to tell you this is probably the least emotional of the ones that I looked at. As I watched those, I lived again, and if you go back in history and you look at one of the pre-videotaped messages before the shuttle took place, they talked to the commander-in-chief about that shuttle, and he said something, obviously looking back, was very significant. He says, you have to risk something to gain something. Oh, doesn't he know that? And don't we know that? Today we're going to look at the book of Hebrews. Now let me just tell you, Hebrews is not easy. One of my professors wrote a commentary on Hebrews. William Lane, he was a professor at Western. And it was one of the more brilliant professors I've known. I think he spoke or at least translated 7 languages. He was expert in Greek and Hebrew, and he wrote a commentary, and I've often looked for footnotes in here of me because I had such an impact on his life. But no, he actually took a bunch of us seminary students came down and took a Christology course with him, and the Christology course was from the book of Hebrews. But the line that I pulled the book from, just to give to you, it says, it conveys a word from God addressed to the harsh reality of life in an insecure world. Sound familiar? If you've ever felt yourself overwhelmed by that reality, Hebrews is a sermon you cannot afford to neglect. Now, Hebrews is unlike any other book in the Bible. It is literally a sermon, a deep one, a long one, but it is a sermon. And so throughout the text of the book of Hebrews, you will find over and over again messages connected to the Old Testament. And in particular, what he's really drilling down is to show us that Jesus is in fact the new high priest. So how do we handle the statement, you have to risk something in order to gain something? If you're one of those folks that like to read ahead to Hebrews chapter 4, 1 through 16, we're going to be making reference points if you want to pull over there. But really the theme around which we're going to land today is verse 11. And my translation of verse 11 would be this: let us therefore risk in order that we might rest. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. Risk in order to rest. The risk part we have certainly nailed down pretty good, but we're going to connect it to the Sabbath rest here in just a few moments, and how those two counterbalance each other. Now, if you don't know much about your Old Testament, you need to know that behind this is the shadow of the story when they were trying to get the Israelites were trying to get to the Promised Land. And so that story is in the background of what the writer is saying in this sermon. And he's saying, God promised to get us to the Promised Land. And if you know anything about that, they got close and then they didn't get in. And then if you go back and look at Joshua and Caleb and that whole story of 12 of them going in to look to see if it was ready to be taken over and move on into Canaan, well, 10 of them came back and said, oh no, you don't want to go there. I see the giants. And so they cautioned the people of God not to lean on the promise of God, but rather to hold back. But of course, Joshua and Caleb chose, saying, no, it's time to move forward. It's time for this. Don't be afraid. Move on. Now, if you're one of those folks that likes to look for idiosyncrasies in Scripture, if you look there, you'll see the word Joshua, but there are even some folks that say, well, Joshua, you know, is a transliteration of what? Greek and Hebrew, it's a translation for Jesus. And so there are some who would say that that's kind of a reference, a foreshadowing of the fact that Jesus was going to be there. So get that image in your mind as we make our way through this section on risk. So, got your outline, want to follow along. Number one, risking will bring the challenge needed for life. I will say to you that if you say the word risk, you say the word challenge. If you say the word challenge, you say the word risk. They are so intertwined into each other. I've never had a challenge in my life that wasn't some way connected to risk, and I've never risked something in my life that was in fact not a challenge. So verses 1 and 2 of chapter 4 of Hebrews. Therefore, let us fear if while a promise remains of entering his rest, that's that Sabbath rest that we're going to talk about in a moment, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. For indeed we have had good news preached to us, just as they also, but the word they heard did not profit them, because it was not united by faith in those who heard it. If I say to you that risk is an indispensable part of life, would you say yes? Yes, you would. But now, what we're going to end with, where we're going to go with in this, is that how much of us have shied away from the risk, and how perhaps because we've shied away from the risk, certainly the risk of giving ourselves more fully to the presence of God, that we have not in fact enjoyed the peace and the Sabbath rest that we're going to talk about. Why do you think it is that we resist risk? Well, I mean, that's pretty easy when you think about it. It's fearful, it's scary, it makes us uncomfortable, it brings frustration. But when's the last time you took a risk and had a significant, wonderful outcome in your life? We just recently visited Boston because I'm a board member for Baptist Life Communities, and every 3 to 4 years they rotate board members and send them to these meetings called leading age meetings. And nobody had to volunteer me for this one because it was in Boston. And so when everybody on the board said, oh, okay, that's Dan's going there, so Neva and I went there. And I couldn't help it. I knew my theme for the week, and as I walked with my son through the new things that are going on in his business, I couldn't think of all the things that we're most amazed with about our son is that his willingness to take a risk. Now, you've got a picture of him there. Fortunately, he looks a lot like his father there. I'm just kidding. Neva she'd kill me. But this is Nicholas talking about his company. Now, I don't know if it's a brag, but just what makes a young man go to Boston? He actually won a contest with 2 of his partners to go up there, and they paid them to build software for 3 months, MIT and Harvard. And then they ended up moving up there. Now they're up to 39 employees, are in 60 countries, and 60,000 hits a month on their website. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And now they're into, Nicholas's dad, it's not worth anything until somebody pays for it, but it's ranked at a very high amount of money, what his company is worth. And I can only say, looking back, I don't know that I saw in this young man the risk that he took in doing that, and the risk that he laid out there. From a 6th grader that got his first laptop, which I have reminded him on numerous occasions I purchased for him, to now to see what he has done with his life is, in fact, amazing. I don't do that so much to brag, although I want to brag because he's a good kid and I'm excited for him. It is the fact that all of us have to make, it's part and parcel to our lives to take some level of risk. I don't know if any of us would take the kind of risk that he did, but he did, and there's certainly some payoff. So challenge or risk will bring stumbling with it, will it not? How many times have you stumbled only to get up quickly and look around to see who saw you? I did that once, coming down, we have a little slope on our driveway, and I'm creeping down and had put a little bit of ice on the ground, getting my newspaper, got my newspaper, was creeping back, holding onto the side of the car. Sure enough, boom, I went down like a ton of brick, slid down my driveway, first thing I realized was I'm hurt. No, I didn't realize, none of that I felt. I got up on my feet and was trying to stand and lean against the car and see who had seen me fall. We all do that, don't we? There's that moment where we fall and we just want to recover. Now, I viewed some videos this week. Have you ever pulled up videos on people falling? I will tell you it's very cruel and we shouldn't do that. It's not funny. But there was this one. He doesn't actually fall, but he kind of does something really stupid. And any of you who are sports fans will remember this. And so I'll let it play and then I will tell you about it.
We'll give you the rest of it after this play. 4th down and 6. And Wright fumbles. Picked up by Leon Lett. Can he go all the way? It's a 60-yard run. He's being chased by Beebe. Watch out. Did he get across? No, they are not. That's going to be a touchback to Buffalo.
You can lower the sound on that. I mean, y'all remember that. I mean, he is going for a touchdown, and he starts celebrating. He puts the ball down, and it's knocked out, and he doesn't get a touchdown. One of the most embarrassing moments in all of sports history. If you listen to the whole thing, Bob Trumpy, by the way, of Cincinnati Bengals, is on there, and they're explaining how incredibly stupid what he did was. And I couldn't help but a couple times the look on his face is just, well, you might say he stumbled a little bit. But challenge will always bring, he put himself into a situation. He had risked his career all these years, and there it was that he was risking, and then right in front of everybody, it dissipated right there. I looked around for different things that I could find on risk, and I came up with one. This is author unknown, but it's one of the more powerful things I read all week. It says, to laugh is to risk appearing the fool. To weep is to risk appearing sentimental. To reach for another is to risk involvement. To expose your feelings, to risk exposing your true self. To place your ideas, your dreams before a crowd is to risk their loss. To love is to risk not being loved in return. To live is to risk dying. To believe is to risk despair. To try is to risk failure. But risks must be taken because the greatest hazard in life is to risk nothing. The person who risks nothing, does nothing, has nothing, is nothing. They may avoid suffering and sorrow, but they cannot learn, feel, change, grow, live, and love. Chained by their attitudes, they are slaves. They have forfeited their freedom, and only a person who risks is free. Profound, isn't it? I mean, that says the whole ball of wax when it comes to risk. So challenge or risk will bring stumbling, but also it'll bring suffering. There is no way around the fact that when you and I risk, when you and I take a challenge, that we in fact will not bring about suffering. The Apostle Paul says it over and over again, and we recently had been reading through 2 Corinthians, and so he says we should trust not in ourselves. What's he saying? He's saying that you're going to bump into pride if you walk around and live your life trusting only in yourself. God help all of us to have friends who will lean into our lives and to help us to know that eventually those of us who trust in ourselves are going to run into problems. One of the things that I've watched through the years is the whole revolving door syndrome. You know what that is? It's, if you're in the medical field, the health field, you know what it is. It's when people, their pride lands them against the wall, they fall down. It could be with alcohol, could be with drugs, could be with whatever. And then they get their lives together, they get going well, and all of a sudden they're right back in there. And it's that revolving syndrome. And if you're not careful, pride will get you just enough to get back up on your feet, but not enough to really get the kind of long-term help that you really need. Risk will bring challenge needed for life, and it will also bring, secondly, the peace needed for life. And this is the best part. It's hard whenever I talk to people about hard things, and risk and challenge is hard. I mean, it is. But to realize that it brings with us a sense of peace. Now, Sabbath rest, when the Hebrews writer is talking about it here, He's talking about it from kind of three perspectives. The first perspective is God created for 6 days and rested on the seventh day. So he's giving a reference to that. But he's also talking about the kind of creative rest that comes when it's not about just not doing something. It's about knowing that you have invested in God and that's going to be enough. That's going to be enough for you. Resting will always bring a peace that's needed for life. So what does that peace look like? Well, verse 8 through 10, for if Joshua, there's that word Joshua, had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. So this new Sabbath rest that we're talking about here is the rest that comes from having made it to the promised land and, in fact, recognizing from the writer of Hebrews that the new rest that we get to live in is authored by the high priest, the new high priest. And who is that high priest? The new high priest is Jesus. And he's the one that, in fact, that has provided for us. So what it appears is that God intended the Sabbath day to be a delight in a way of sharing with God's presence. So how is it that we're going to be able to get this rest? Let me give you 3 ways. Resting brings quietness. How comfortable are you with quietness in your life? I've shared with you on more than one occasion, I have to have quietness in my life. It is an absolute necessity for me, and if I don't, I just don't function well. What's the kind of pollution that crowds our lives to keep quietness from happening? Well, how about the noise of news talk shows or the traffic or whatever it might be, but just the constant movement? How about the speed with which we live our lives, the quickness, the appointments, the constant nature of our lives? And some of us have that inclination. I lean in that direction a little bit. But I will tell you, I am not a good, I cannot save myself from that. I have to let God settle in on me and save me from that. How about the activities? How many of you can just always tell this, how many of you get your calendar out, and most of us who are into calendars now are electronically wired, you get out and your juices kind of flow. You just love moving those little colored blocks around and getting everything in place for the upcoming week. Well, I'm one of those sickos. I mean, I love getting my life in order, but I also know that I'm going to move at least 12 of those blocks to other places throughout the week because your life is simply going to change. But the block that we need not to move is the block that we say, I need that quiet time with God. Mother Teresa said it this way. She says, we need to find God, and he cannot be found in noise and restlessness. God is a friend of silence. He is, isn't he? Now, a humorous way to look at that would be the young child that had noticed and went to his mother. He says, Mommy, why does the pastor get a month vacation in the summer when Daddy only gets 3 weeks? To which the mother, being a very wise mother, says to him, well, son, if he's a good minister, he needs it. If he's a bad minister, well, the congregation need him to be away for that time. So there is always a need for us to have a certain level of silence. Secondly, the resting brings not only quietness, but it brings winsomeness. Now, I was reminded from the first service, I was making my rounds in between the services like I always do, and I went by. There's a ladies' class in our building, and they are called the Winsome class. Now, I kind of knew that, but when I went by to see them today, what did they have plastered on their door? The Winsome class, to remind me that they had long since discovered the word winsome and that it was them. Well, some of them are still here, so I'm not going to say anything more about that right now, but winsome means it lends itself to being a kind of laughter with a good kind of expectation, a warm-spirited person, a person that brings energy. I have in the first service, there was one of my former students who was a little bit scary, but he retired. He was a late student in my teaching, but he was here, And one of my other students that was in a class real close to his, Joel, Carwile, was recently at one of our association meetings. And I would say if I could put one word on Joel's life, it would be winsome. I mean, he has a sense of being warm and genuine. And I've often wondered, why do we not connect laughter with our Christian faith? Because for me, I'll tell you, a person who has a sense of laughter, I was sitting in my office this morning looking over my notes, and I could hear people laughing in the hallway. Now, did I go out there and say, come on, guys, can you keep it down? No, I enjoyed the laughter because it was a part of them expressing one to the other a sense of how they could do that. Chuck Swindoll was, I guess, the guy that I read about it as being winsome. He used the word winsome in one of the devotionals I read some time back, and he gave 3 clues as to how you might be able to be winsome, and I thought these were good. First of all, start each day with pleasant words. How difficult would that be? Well, fortunately, I'm married to Neva, and there are no unpleasant words spoken at our house. I'm just telling you, she just has a sense for speaking pleasant words. How about smiling more often? In Boston, I noticed nobody meets eyes in Boston when you're walking on the street. Everybody's busy, 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 busy. And the only persons I could ever find to meet my eye typically were homeless people. And they would meet your eyes. But smile. And thirdly, express one honest compliment or appreciation to every person that you spend a significant amount of time with each day. Now, I know some of you, that'd be hard work for some of the folks, but thinking about one compliment, a point of appreciation for that person, then likely you would be winsome. Thirdly, resting brings quietness, it brings winsomeness, and this is the kind of my made-up word. It brings fair expecting. Fair expecting. Now, that means not over-expecting, not under-expecting, but fair expecting. How many of you get tied up on your expectations? You set your expectations, and when those expectations are not met, you get frustrated, and you churn about those, and it upsets your whole day just because you miss those sense of expectations. Well, for those who are over-expectors, enough is never going to be enough. If you set your expectations and you meet them, then you'll just raise them up again. But under-expectors are those that just kind of duck, they want to settle for less and less. Their favorite word would be mediocrity. Just kind of settle in the middle, don't get noticed, and that would be it. For me, it's fair expecting. And that's the tension that we live in. It's not being a mediocre life. It's not being heavy with expectations. It's living in a sense of God's risk and his rest. A story about a man who was able to do that in some way, I think. I've been reading a book by David Brooks on character. So I've gotten intrigued by some people that he talked about. And one of the stories I did some research on and found is just very, very powerful story. It's a story of a man who literally had what you would call one of the worst days a person could ever have. Let me tell you about it. This particular man was a politician. He worked in the New York Assembly at the time that I'm telling this, the late 1800s. He was at work and they received a telegram. That tells you somewhat of the age of where this story took place. He arrived at his office, and so a telegram came and had a 3-word sentence on the telegram. It said, "Come home now." Well, and he did that, but he also knew that his wife had recently given birth to a child, so obviously he was concerned. Made his way there, and so the next train, he made his way back to New York City. He walked through the door of his home, and his brother said something fairly ominous. He said, "There is a curse in this house." He said he always remembered that. Rushing up to the bedroom, he began to comfort his wife, who was having significant complications from childbirth. And those that were in the house would later say they could hear him lamenting from that bedroom, let her live, please let her live. Well, sometime during the night, the family member intruded upon his solitude and whispered, "If you want to see your mother before she dies, you need to come downstairs right away." That's right, his mother was sick as well. The man left his wife, walked down a flight of steps, and there it was that he lingered with his mother until she passed away at 3 a.m. that morning. Well, he returned to the mother of his new infant daughter, and there it was that he held on to her, and she would later pass at 2 p.m. later that afternoon. You wouldn't be surprised to know that he walked defiantly into his office, and across the daily diary, he slashed the word X, and he wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." That day was Valentine's Day of all day, February the 14th, 1884. If you can imagine this, there were two identical rosewood caskets at the New York Fifth Avenue Presbyterian that week when he sat there in daze trying to make it through. Well, his life took significant turns, but it did recover. You may know him, you will know him, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was also governor of New York and later became, yes, the President of the United States. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. He wrote words that I have found to be the most profound words I keep very close to me, and I've looked at them again this week as I've talked about risking and resting in God's Spirit. It is not the critic, he says, who counts, not the one who points out how the strong man tumbled or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the person who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, and spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. For me, that inspires me because I belong to Christ. And in the risking of my life for Christ, I also know the incredible peace.